finally, this final lesson here about the third chapter and how we deal with these benefits and these powers that Patanjali talks about, we're going to look at some sutras that help us live better in the world with others. Now, this might sound similar to the yamas, which are principles that allow us to live in relationship to others. This is a more subtle progression towards understanding this concept. How do we live in the world with others? So, Sutra 317, Patanjali says, language is a barrier to understanding. When you focus on the sound of a word, its condition, the form the object described by a word takes, its form, and the purpose of that object, its purpose, through the process of samyama, you can understand all beings regardless of language. So I think that this is a pretty interesting sutra because what Patanjali has recognized is that language is a barrier. People speak different languages, and because we speak different languages, it can be really hard to communicate with one another. But when we take away language and we look specifically at the sound of a word, now remember, Sanskrit as a language is really, really interested in and dependent upon the sound of the word because the sound contains so much of the meaning of the word. Patanjali is calling that the condition. The form the object described by a word takes, and then what purpose that object serves. If we were to just look at the sound that someone's making to describe a particular object and then think about the purpose that that object is serving, we can understand generally what someone is talking about without actually understanding their language. Now let's just break this down into a really specific example. I speak English, somebody else might be speaking Spanish. When we travel throughout the world in countries where people speak different languages, we are able to communicate, but we aren't necessarily able to rely on the words that we use or the sounds that we hear that are familiar to us because we're speaking different languages. So what do? We have to use body language to communicate in a slightly different way. We have to use tonality, which can really be where that sound plays in so that we can communicate what it is that we're trying to say and the tone and the energy behind what it is that we're trying to say. And then we might point to actual objects. So for example, pen. Like if somebody's trying to say you need to sign this, they might like hand a pen and do this and communicate with a tone that tells us that this is an instruction. So there's ways for us to communicate that don't require us to understand the same words. And when we understand that, we understand that the words themselves are very subjective. It's the entirety of the situation, the sound, the form, the purpose that communicates what it is that we need done and how it is that we need to relate with one another and be with one another. And if we can communicate with the entirety of our environment, with the idea of the purpose and the form and the sound or the condition, then we can understand everything and we don't need language necessarily. So this is asking us to get familiar with that more subtle understanding of everything that's going on around us and how we communicate. And if you've heard of people before who say things like, I know that you're angry, and nobody even says anything. They're like, how do you know I'm angry? You can just tell that a partner perhaps or a friend is angry by the way that they hold themselves. So that's tapping into some of this more subtle intuition and these nonverbal cues that help us communicate and collaborate in the world with others that is beyond what words can give us, because our energy can't necessarily be communicated with words. So we have to develop a way to communicate with all of us and all of the tools available to us. One of the things that I've done before in class when actually presenting this sutra to the class was a really fun experiment. I asked everybody in the class to think of a cow. And you can do that too right now. Think of a cow. And all of you in your mind are going to think, myself included, of a cow. And the cow that I'm going to think of then is a particular image of a cow. And the way that I'm going to come up with that particular image of the cow is going to be based on my memories and my experience of life and how I've experienced cows. Now, what I did then in the class was I asked everybody, okay, how many of you thought of a white cow with black spots? And I asked people to raise their hands. And then I said, how many of you thought of a black cow or a brown cow? And some people raised their hands. How many of you thought of a cow that was a milk cow? Some people raised their hands. How many of you thought of a cow that was a cow being raised for meat? Some people raised their hands. How many of you thought of a cow that was on a farm? Some people raised their hands. How many of you thought of a cow that was like out in the wild? Some people raised their hands. So you can see that the word cow doesn't really do anything, because although it gives a general idea, the specifics are different for each person based on their own experience of life, their own experience of cow in their life. And culturally, cows in Hinduism are really sacred. So somebody who has that experience and that culture in their life is going to think of cows very differently than someone who's a rancher in Texas and has a very specific relationship to cows. So I think it's really interesting that Patanjali puts this in the Yoga Sutra, this acknowledgement that language isn't going to help us communicate. Communication needs to happen on a different, more subtle level. And it's important that we cultivate these subtle characteristics through understanding our subtle body, through understanding our energy, through understanding how to listen, through understanding the elements and how all of these component parts play into the way that we interact in the world with others, so that we can collaborate more efficiently and effectively with everybody in our life and with ourself. Sutra 318 says, by bringing awareness through the process of samyama to your conditioned responses, you can gain knowledge of your past lives. Now we're back to those past lives again. We can argue whether or not that's helpful, but what I think is really amazing is that Patanjali tells us we need to look at our conditioned responses. How have we been conditioned to respond to the world based on the processes and the systems that have been given to us in our environment, through our parents, through however it was that we were raised, through our careers, through society's expectations. We need to become aware of that, because those are external responses, anything that's conditioned from the outside. And when we can see that a response has been conditioned from external responses, we then have the power to say, that's not me, that's not mine, that's not my true self. And when we have that awareness, then we can go about changing it, changing our mind, changing our perceptions, changing our environment, changing our choices, so that we can move through the world in more alignment with what it is that we feel is right for ourselves. Sutra 319, Patanjali says, by focusing through the process of samyama on someone else's mind as expressed through their speech, mannerisms, and vocalized thoughts, you can gain knowledge about other people's minds. Here is where Patanjali tells us that we can read other people's minds. But Patanjali is really specific and says that we're focusing on someone else's mind, but not just their thoughts, their speech and how it's expressed, their mannerisms, those nonverbal cues, and how they're vocalizing the thoughts that are moving through their head. Then we can gain knowledge about other people's minds. Why would we want to know that? What good does that do? Well, if we know how other people are thinking, we can better interact with those people. In Sutra 320, Patanjali goes on to say, however, you can only know the quality of someone's state of mind, not their actual thoughts. So he's not actually telling us that we can read people's minds, like see their thoughts and know exactly what they're thinking, but we can better understand the quality of their state of mind. This person is angry. This person is uncertain. This person is happy, excited, whatever that is. Again, by cultivating these subtle characteristics, we can better understand someone and how they might be experiencing life in any given moment. And then we can choose to be empathic. We can choose to be compassionate. We can choose to work with this person, and we have so many more tools available to us because we understand where they're coming from, not completely oblivious or tone deaf to their current experience in the world. And when you just think of this from, say, a business perspective, if you understand where someone is at, you can then approach that person in a way that best helps them. And it doesn't even have to be business, it can be any relationship. From a partner relationship, a mother daughter relationship, a mother son relationship. When we understand the person that we are in relationship with and where they're coming from, and we have that understanding at a more subtle level, we're better able to connect and communicate with that person. We're better able to develop trust. And through trusting relationships, we can better able work together to create a better world. So some of the principles that we can take from these sutras include focus, again, purpose, moving in through the world with purpose so that the world can become a better place, developing that understanding between people, moving through transformation so that we can change the way that we move through the world in a way that is more aligned with our purpose and is more understanding, and then developing empathy for others. And these are the qualities that allow us to live in the world with others and collaborate and communicate and be together in a way that is much more unifying and much less divisive. I hope that you have found these ideas inspiring